The problem is it's the perception that people have. If they think you're involved in some non-ethical behavior, then they will presume that you're a non-ethical person. And if it goes viral on the social media, then it takes about 80 weeks for your reputation to get back to what it was.
This episode is brought to you by Green Skies Analytics, an audit analytics service provider that works with internal audit departments that have data analysts and are still frustrated with trying to make analytics actually work, aren't getting the expected ROI, who can't break through the communication barrier between the analysts and the audit team, and those that need experienced direction for an audit analytics strategy and process. Those that feel like they've wasted time and money on trainings, aren't getting the value they want, not prioritizing the highest risk areas for the organizations, or have projects that seemingly never get completed. Do you deal with any of that? If you do, go to the show notes of this episode and click the Green Skies Analytics link, or go to greenskiesanalytics.com to schedule a call and understand how Green Skies Analytics makes analytics actually work for internal audit.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Audit Podcast. I'm your host, Trent Russell. Marc serves on the Audit Committee for the Ontario Treasury Board Secretariat, as well as Public Safety Canada, and he is the MBA Program Director for the University of Ottawa. He's been at the University of Ottawa for over 30 years, so I feel like we got a very academic Audit Committee perspective here, which is new to the show. This episode probably pairs well with the episode we had last week. We were talking about the 3 lines of defense. So we talked first, second, third line, the misconceptions between those. One of the first things that we talk about with Marc is if people respect internal control. So at a board level, but then also at kind of the first line level as well. So I think that pairs nicely with that previous episode from last week. We also talk about reputational risk over financial risk, how we can monitor and prevent those things from happening to the degree that we can. We always talk about financial risk, or at least most of us in internal audit talk financial risk, but here we're really kind of honing in on the reputational risk. And then as an audit committee, what's the 1 or 2 things that Marc feels like is the most important task for him as an audit committee member? And then common challenges that he faces as an audit committee chair. And so take those, empathize with your audit committee chair. It could probably even help with conversations with them. If you don't have a great relationship with them, take those last 2 points, kind of think about those and see about how you can help basically your audit committee chair or your audit committee members, especially with empathizing with them and really just kind of helping them as well as they help you. With that said, here we go. What is in either your internet browsing history or maybe your ChatGPT or Llama or Claude or any other LLM solution that's out there right now? What have you been looking into, researching, etc. in your spare time?
I've been looking for ethical dilemmas for professional in different industries, and what are the best option in order to, I would say, act ethically, because very often the problem is we take for granted that what we do is ethical. So I use ChatGPT on a regular basis just to challenge myself to say, if I was to do it this way, would that be perceived as something ethical? Because ethics these days for professional, it's all about perception. It's not really about what is in regulation or rules. It's about the perception that people will have.
And you're saying perception relative to like reputation risk? Is that what we're talking about?
Exactly. In terms of reputational risk, the problem is it's the perception that people have. If they think you're involved in some non-ethical behavior, then they will presume that you're a non-ethical person. And if it goes viral on the social media, then it takes about 80 weeks for your reputation to get back to what it was before the allegation. And I'm not even talking about a conviction, just talking about an allegation. So 80 weeks,
Yeah.
for some people, it's a year and a half. For guys like me, it's 560 nights that you go to sleep wondering what's going to come up next day.
That's a good stat. I did not realize that. Thank you for sharing that. If you haven't already, there is a book. I'm going to maybe butcher it, but we'll get enough of it right that people can look it up. But The Politics of Internal Auditing, or Politicking in Internal Audit, something like
Good.
that. It was co-authored by Patty Miller, who was on the show, and she's going to get mad at me because I forget the other co-author, but they weren't on the show, so it's hard for me to remember. Anyway, that has probably been, I've said this multiple times on the show, there is no book on how to be a chief audit executive. There's a lot of books around how to be a CEO, how to be a CDO, how to be a CMO, a CI. There's a lot of books on that. There's not any really specifically on that. But I felt like what they put together is probably the closest thing, because it speaks to the reason I'm saying all this. It speaks to exactly what you're talking about. you're going to be, as a CAE, I forget the numbers, but let's call it around 60% of the time, you're going to get some kind of external pressure from the board or someone to go something to the effect of, I know you found that finding, don't publish it, basically, like sweep that under the rug or something to that effect, where it does call into your ethics and you have to make that decision. And so the one quote that I really love that someone said was basically keep your 2 weeks notice or your notice in your pocket at all times, because as a CAE, you never know when you're going to have to go, I'm not doing that. I'm not going to sweep that under the rug. I quit, basically. And I thought that was really powerful. Hey, everybody, we'll get back to the guests, but real quick, just wanted to let you know, block your calendars for March 5th, 2025. If you attended the Audit Analytics and AI conference back in the fall, we're going to do a mini Audit Analytics and AI conference on March 5th. So it's going to be from 9 to 4. So we're going to go 9 to 12. Then we'll do an hour break, and then 1 to 4. These are Central Time, so Chicago time zone. All right, so go ahead, block your calendars off, and we'll make the announcement when registration opens. All right, back to the show. What about, totally unrelated, but what about emojis in emails? Are you for them or against them?
Actually, I'm against that because sometimes it may actually not express fully what you want to say, especially if you're a professional. If it's with friends, you can use emojis. I'm all cool with that. But if you're a professional and in their communication, you have to be careful because I might laugh at something. It doesn't mean I agree to it. I might find it funny the way you said it, in the context you said it, but it doesn't mean that I'm supporting this. And these days, with all the international conflicts and stuff, that we have to be careful with what we say, what we do. I would say be very, very careful with emojis. Just a thumbs up, which is technically all good. Well, it means you agreed to something. And we have seen in auditing that when there was one case that was pretty famous because the person was in charge of the building of a large project. And what happened was that, sorry, I should say the construction of a large project. And what happened was that there were some extras. So the supplier sent them a texto in which he says, hey, we're going to have additional costs related to the project. Do you agree? And he just said like thumbs up, but he didn't say I agree on the amount they're going to charge me. I agree that yes, there might be some additional charges. And it went to court and they said, yeah, you agreed with the fact that they would charge you additional amount. You didn't not ask how much, but you agreed. So we're upholding you to that. So that's one thing that we have to be careful. I think we can still communicate these days, and just like put a couple of words, but don't just use emojis because sometimes it might send the wrong signal, and then this is could lead in a reputational risk once again.
I think that's been so we've just started asking that question maybe the past 5 or 6 weeks or guess worth anyway. And I think the common theme has basically been how your emoji could be interpreted by someone else, and that's where it can get kind of tricky. And then by and large, yeah, the more formal the relationship, the less emojis. I think if we diagrammed it, that would be it. All right, that's interesting. I didn't know that story about the thumbs up, which yeah, he meant okay, not like okay, I received your message, I heard, not yes, I agree to that. That's interesting. Haven't heard that side of it yet. Okay. This was something I thought was interesting that you mentioned when we were doing the pre-recorded, I'm sorry, the kickoff call. So before we hit the record button, where you said you feel like some folks don't respect internal controls. And I was a little not shocked, but I went, okay, well, that, kind of sucks. As an internal auditor, basically, you don't want to hear that. But I think it's also important to understand the truth and the reality of the situation. So why did you speak to it like that? Why do you say people don't respect internal controls? And is there a certain group maybe that doesn't?
Okay, I would say people will, whenever they see an internal control, they try to see is there a way around. They try to find the loophole. Like all these people, the chief loophole officer at their
Mhm.
organization, they're there. They really wonder and they question a lot about the control. Like, can you explain in details? And at one point, you feel they're very interested, but technically, what they're doing is just validating what you will tell them. And then what you haven't said, they're going to say, well, you didn't say that I wasn't able to. So there we go. I assume that I could. So it's not that because when we put internal control, technically we're controlling something, we're restricting people to do something that we don't want them to do. So for some people, to receive a restriction, and especially these days, people don't like to be told that they're not allowed to do whatever they want. So if you tell them that there is a restriction, they're going to try to find a way around. And that's the danger. So it's not that they don't believe in internal control. They think that if the internal control doesn't prohibit them from doing something, that they can do it. And that's where I make the difference between the letter of the law, which is compliance, and the spirit of the law, which is ethics. So this is where I tell, be careful. Ask yourself, why did they put that control? What was the intention? And then from there, you might say, okay, yes, that's right. The control right now might not be working efficiently. So, but still, I'm not going to take advantage of it. I will report it. Say, by the way, when you're saying that you have this internal control in place, honestly, it's really not working. But don't use it and abuse it. Report it. Make sure to change it. That's usually so. Some people might feel that imposing controls on them is something that they cannot really deal with, and they're going to try to find a loophole. If they can find loophole, then they will actually comply. But if they can try to find a way around, they might try to.
And is this, would you say people by and large and how we are as people, or is it a segment of people?
It's the young generation when they are in high schools and universities. We always negotiate with them. We don't tell them that they're not maybe subject matter expert in what they're doing, which is logic. They're at university. They feel they're subject matter expert. They feel that you cannot tell them that they're not doing something right because it's not good for their self-esteem. So whenever you try to put a control, they're smart. They'll find ways around. And if they can't, they're going to use Chat GPT. So it's the people who usually try to find ways around internal controls are smart. They're not stupid, because the stupid one would just like they just don't care. The other one are smarter. They try to support what they say or to justify it, to rationalize it by saying, well, the control wasn't clear enough. So, and if they can't do it themselves, they use ChatGPT to find a way around. They say, hey, this is
Yep.
the control. Is there a way around it? And unfortunately, ChatGPT will probably provide them a way around it.
Okay. And let's say one of those, like you circumvented control, and that does lead to, I know reputational risk has been something that you've kind of like breadcrumb trailed through the conversation already. You've dropped it in a couple times. I know it's an area of interest to you, one of your areas of expertise. But if that does lead to some kind of reputational risk, how can we mitigate those? Because we do talk a lot about financial risk within internal audit, especially if you're on the SOC side, obviously. But what about the reputational risk side of things?
The reputational risk is all about telling people, yes, there is compliance and yes, there is ethics. And what we were asking from you, we're asking from you to be ethical. Yes, you need to comply, but always ask yourself, if I'm complying, is that enough? Or what is the perception that people will have? So you train people, and you also ask the people within your organization to monitor what's going on. And by saying what to monitor it, what I really mean is to have those people internally, and because they are the one who are seeing the non-ethical behavior that might have an impact, and to report it to feel good. But too often we refer to those people as whistleblowers. We should change the name. We should call them ethics ambassadors, which is more beautiful, and they will be less afraid of retaliation. So you don't call your reporting line a whistleblowing hotline. You call your reporting line an ethics line, which is beautiful. And then from there, you're going to install a culture of ethics. Sometimes people ask me, Mark, like, what's the culture of my organization? Where do I go to find my corporate culture on paper? I say, you don't need to do so. Just turn around, look, and see the less ethical behavior that you see that is being tolerated by management. So that's the importance. Sometimes management will tolerate unethical behavior because the person has a good heart or the person doesn't have bad intention. It doesn't matter. For someone who will witness it and who will have the perception, this is what's going to be the problem. So that's when I tell people, it's not about your intention. It's about the signal that you're sending. So in terms of auditing, we notice those things. So if there is a control or a procedure in place, and if some people don't respect it, well, that's a problem. So it shows that you will tolerate it, which is not what you really want to do. So perception.
Yeah. Is there I think everybody loves a good like fraud story or, reputational risk story, maybe in this case. Is there a good like use case a story that you could share with the audience?
Well, I think McDonald had one a few years ago when their CEO was involved in what he said was a consensual relationship with one of their employee, which happened to be true. But at the same time, when they investigated, they realized that he was also involved in three different other type of relationship involving employees, but those were not being consensual. So that was an example of people who actually knows there is rules and code of conduct in place. They don't think it applies to them because they say, "Hey, we're both single. So if we're single, what's wrong with it?" Well, it's not the way it goes. There's code of conducts you need to, and code of conducts apply to everyone. We also had some international organizations that were helping people, like the Red Cross. Well, their biggest reputational issues came from the volunteers. And it's hard to monitor volunteers because technically they're not on your payroll. They're a good-hearted person, but when they go into critical situation, sometimes they might actually not act ethically. And by saying not act ethically is they might decide who's going to get the food or who's going to get the whatever we provide them. And that's not the way it should go. They have to follow the procedure, the guideline. Otherwise, it gives a perception that if you get friendly with them, you're going to have the aid first, which is not the way it is.
Yeah. And as a audit committee chair, is reputational risk top of mind for you, or is there something maybe more important? Like what's your most important task, you would say, as
Uh,
audit committee member?
I would say most important task is to make sure that people understand the role and the added value of internal control. So we always make sure that whenever we put the control in place, that people fully understand why we do it. So we tell them what is the nature of the control and why. So not only the letter, but the spirit. Why did we put that control in place? And we tell people we're trying it. If ever you find out that there is an issue, it's not working as it should, we're going to monitor as best as we can, but please feel free to report, feel free to prevent. And this is what I always say. As an audit chair, you always want to make sure that you will prevent things from happening. Detecting is one thing, and you always feel good when you detected something because then you have something to show. But prevention is way better. I'm always happy when someone said, "Man, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know what's my added value because technically nothing ever happened." Well, if it doesn't happen, it maybe because you're doing your job correctly and your people knows about it. So sometimes prevention is way better than detection.
Okay. And then from again, the audit chair perspective, let's say you're any given CAE that you're working with, if you had to measure maybe their success or their impact, you can kind of take that however you want to, but if you had like one metric to use, which obviously isn't realistic, but for the sake of, the thought exercise, what would that metric be to be able to say, yes, effective CAE or no, ineffective CAE?
I would look at complaints against the control that we have put in place. Whenever we put new control, if there is no complaint at all, there's something strange. It's probably because people found a loophole. They found a way around. Whenever you're putting a new control in place, technically it restricts people from doing what they might want to do. So from some of them, they might actually voice themselves to say, "Come on, are you serious, man? That's going to slow me down. That's additional work." You just say, "Oh, okay, all good. Thank you very much." I always wonder, like, I always trust people who challenge me, the one who just dodged the bullet, I'm always kind of suspicious. So I would say if we have a chief audit executive and people always say, "Oh my God, they're always coming up with new requirements, new procedures." Well, if this is our intention, I'm happy with it. If they all say, "Oh no, it's all good. He's the best person in town. He's so approachable. He's such a nice," which is all great. But in a certain way, they need to fear and respect that person better than to love and abuse that person. So sometimes if you're feared for the right reason, I'm all good with it.
And aside maybe from, I'll just call that controls execution or controls implementation, and that
True.
being an issue that you have to work with, what are some other common challenges you face as a audit chair?
Um, I I see people who are doing non-ethical behavior not because they have bad intention. They suffer from performance anxiety.
Hmm.
They cannot accept the fact that they might not reach the target that was set or to get the good or an excellent performance evaluation, then they get all stressed out and they will make unethical behavior and unethical choices. And it's all about when they're going to be facing an ethical dilemma. One thing I want to make sure is they will never take an ethical dilemma and convert it into a cost benefit decision to say, okay, if I was not to respect the rule, the procedure, what would be the impact? Is it less than what I'm going to get out of it? That's first thing that I don't want them to do. And secondly, I want them to feel comfortable to challenge, but also to come up with new procedures, new guidelines. I always tell them, if you're going to be a chief audit officer, I want you to think like a criminal. I want you to think like someone who's going to take advantage of what we have right now in place. Because if you think that what we have is the best, I'm happy with it. But try to challenge it. Try to say, hey, if I would be a bad person, how could I do it? And then if you find out how you would do it, then put internal controls in place in order to make sure that cannot happen.
Got it. All right, I'll give you the floor now. So speaking to largely internal auditors on this podcast, although there's external, there's risk management, there's some cyber folks also that listen. But knowing that's the primary audience, what's the lasting message you want to leave with the audience today?
I would say your role as a gatekeeper, because technically that's what you're doing, you're a gatekeeper, is not one that is easy. It's not one that's going to make you very popular. So people might not always like what you're doing, which is normal because that's part of your role to put controls in place to actually prevent things from happening. But keep in mind, people will respect you if what you're doing is the right thing. If you lead by example, if you apply the procedures or the controls uniformly, you're not favoring people over others. It applies to the chair of the board, same as the volunteer. It applies to everyone within the organization. Uh, as I said before, it's better to be feared and respected than to be loved and abused. And very often, the biggest challenge you're going to have is with what you're going to be coming with people that you get along with. They might try to ask you, oh, well, could you do me a favor? If you're a chief audit executive, well, you don't do favor for people. You might give advice, but you don't do favors. So you will never be the most popular person. But on another way, maybe that's just doing your job correctly. So if you know that what you're doing is the right thing when no one is watching, then you got it made.
Hey everyone, thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Audit Podcast. Whatever platform you're listening on right now, I'm sure there's a subscribe button somewhere, so please hit the subscribe button there. If you're listening through iTunes or Spotify, feel free to go give us that 5-star rating. It only took me about 16 seconds to give myself a 5-star review, and it really helps to get future guests to come on the show, so we'd really appreciate that. Lastly, be sure to check out the show notes and follow us on all our social media channels on Instagram, on LinkedIn, and on TikTok. Also, if interested, please sign up for our weekly newsletter from the Audit Podcast. Thank you all. Have a great one.